There is a room in the Egyptian desert that has been sitting in water for over 3,000 years, and the men who first climbed down into it were so unsettled by what they found that they refused to believe it belonged to the age everyone later assigned it to. 10 granite pillars, each one a single block dragged from a quarry 250 miles away, hold up horizontal beams so heavy that modern engineers still pause when they read the numbers. The joints between the stones are cut so precisely that you cannot slide a coin into the seam. There is no mortar. There is no decoration. There is almost nothing that looks like the Egypt you picture when you close your eyes. And for 100 years, archaeologists, historians, and a small army of independent researchers have argued about one simple question. Who actually built this thing? And why does it feel like it belongs to a different world than the temple standing directly in front of it? Stay with me, because the answer is stranger and more interesting than either side of that argument usually admits. And by the end, you will understand exactly why this single building at Abydos has become one of the most contested sites in all of Egyptology. We are at Abydos, in the low desert of southern Egypt, a place that was sacred to the Egyptians for longer than most civilizations have existed at all. Kings of the very first dynasties were buried here around 3000 BCE. The Egyptians believed one of those early tombs belonged to Osiris himself, the god of death and rebirth, and for thousands of years afterward pilgrims walked here from across the kingdom to leave offerings at what they considered the threshold between the living world and the underworld. So when a pharaoh chose to build something at Abydos, he was not just building a monument. He was staking a claim to the oldest and most sacred ground in Egypt. Standing above everything else at the site is the Temple of Seti I, a new kingdom masterpiece built around 1290 BCE. Nobody disputes this building. Every wall is carved, every column decorated, every surface loaded with painted relief. It contains the famous Abydos King list, the carved sequence of royal names historians still use to reconstruct Egypt's dynastic order. It is exactly what you would expect a wealthy, confident empire to build when it wanted to impress both gods and mortals. Then you walk behind it, down a long descending passage, and the entire mood of the place changes. This is the Osireion. Where the temple in front is busy and ornate, the Osireion is silent and stripped bare. 10 massive granite pillars, perfectly square, carry horizontal archways of stone weighing up to 100 tons apiece. For comparison, most of the blocks in the Great Pyramid weigh between 2 and 15 tons, and even the largest granite beams roofing the king's chamber are estimated at somewhere between 50 and 80 tons. The Osireion's beams are heavier than that, set not on top of a rising pyramid, but down inside a sunken chamber at the level of the water table. There is no painted procession of gods here, no dense hieroglyphic frieze wrapping every column, just raw, monumental geometry and standing water pooling around a stone platform in the center that archaeologists call the Osiris bed. The granite itself is a mystery worth pausing on, even though the route it traveled is not disputed. This is red Aswan granite, quarried roughly 250 miles south of Abydos and floated down the Nile, the same source the Egyptians used for obelisks, sarcophagi, and colossal statues throughout their history. Moving stone that size over that distance, and then setting it into a below-grade chamber with joints this tight, was, by any measure, one of the more demanding engineering projects the Egyptians ever undertook. That is not in dispute. What has been disputed for over a century now is when it happened and whose project it actually was. The story of that dispute begins in 1902, when Flinders Petrie noticed a strange depression behind the temple and sent his colleague Margaret Murray to investigate. Murray and her team uncovered part of the structure and published the first account of it in 1904, describing an unusual, austere hall unlike anything else known from the period. A decade later, the Swiss Egyptologist Edouard Neville returned with a larger team, finally clearing the flooded central hall in full. Neville was struck by how little the building resembled anything from the New Kingdom, and in his 1914 report he leaned toward an earlier date, wondering aloud whether the core of the structure might predate the dynasty that supposedly commissioned it. He was not a fringe figure. He was one of the most respected field archaeologists of his generation, and his hesitation reflected a real and reasonable observation. The architecture in front of him did not look like it belonged next to the temple behind which it sat. For about a decade, that uncertainty stood as the closest thing to an official position. Then, between 1925 and 1930, the Egypt Exploration Society sent a young Dutch archaeologist named Henri Frankfurt to finish the job properly. Frankfurt did something Neville and Murray had not fully done. He dug down into the foundations themselves, layer by layer, recording exactly what kind of pottery and debris sat at each depth. What he found at the very bottom of the foundation trenches was a mix of material from the Archaic period and the early Old Kingdom, meaning the site had been used and disturbed long before Seti I. But above that early layer, sealed beneath the structure's own foundations, he found nothing until material from the New Kingdom itself. No continuous occupation, no in-between layers that would suggest a much older building standing here and simply being reused. The stratigraphy told a coherent story. The ground had old debris in it, as almost any patch of Abydos would, but the Osireion's foundations were cut and filled in the time of Seti I, not inherited from some lost, unrecorded age. Frankfurt published his findings in 1933 in a 2-volume report, The Cenotaph of Seti I at Abydos, and it remains the most complete archaeological record of the site to this day. So why does the building look so radically different from everything else Seti I ever built? This is where the story actually gets interesting, because the answer is not that the builders were hiding something. It is that they were doing something on purpose, and once you understand Egyptian religious symbolism, the austerity stops looking like a mystery and starts looking like a message. In Egyptian cosmology, the world began when a mound of dry land rose out of an infinite, dark, primordial ocean called None. Life, order, and the first sunrise all emerged from that watery chaos. Osiris, the god this entire complex is dedicated to, died and was resurrected, and his myth was deliberately tied to that same imagery of water, darkness, and rebirth. The Osireion's sunken position below the water table, its plain and heavy stonework, and a small raised platform sitting like an island in the center were not accidents of poor planning. They were an architectural recreation of the moment of creation itself, a deliberately archaic, deliberately stripped-down space built to evoke an age older than memory, specifically because the building was meant to function as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb for the god of the underworld. Seti I's actual temple in front, covered in relief and color, was where the pharaoh presented himself to the living world and to the gods of the state cult. The Osireion, hidden behind and beneath it, was where he associated himself with something far older and more primal, the myth of death and resurrection itself. Two buildings, two completely different purposes, built by the same king within a few years of each other. That is not a contradiction. It is a fairly common pattern in monumental religious architecture across many cultures, where the most sacred interspaces are often built to look older, plainer, and more mysterious than the public-facing structures around them. The cartouches of Seti I found throughout the Osireion are also frequently misdescribed online as later additions carved onto an already existing structure, as if someone had scratched a signature onto something they merely discovered. Frankfurt's detailed epigraphic survey did not support that reading. The inscriptions, including an ancient label identifying the structure by the phrase Menmater is beneficial to Osiris, appear consistent with the building's own construction phase rather than as intrusive later graffiti. Later kings, such as Merneptah, Seti I's grandson, do appear to have completed decorative work left unfinished at Seti's death, which is unsurprising, since large royal building projects were very often finished by successors. That is a normal feature of Egyptian construction history, not evidence of forgery or usurpation. None of this means every question about the Osireion has been closed. Egyptology is not a field that pretends to have every answer, and honest researchers still debate exactly how the massive Aswan granite beams are transported and precisely leveled into a chamber already close to the water table, since no surviving text walks us through the engineering step by step. The lack of a boastful inscription describing the feat is a genuine oddity worth noticing, though it is worth remembering that plenty of ancient construction projects, even famous ones, went undocumented by their own builders. Absence of a written brag is not the same as absence of a builder. It is also true that the site has become a magnet for theories well outside mainstream archaeology, and it is worth naming a few of them honestly, because you have probably run into versions of these claims elsewhere online. Some argue the erosion patterns on nearby structures at Giza and elsewhere indicate a much older date for large-scale Egyptian stonework, sometimes stretching back over 10,000 years. Mainstream geologists who have examined this weathering generally attribute it to groundwater action and salt crystallization rather than ancient rainfall, and the claim has not been accepted by the geological community. Others point to a carved flower of life pattern scratched into one of the Osireion's roofing slabs as evidence of some lost, universal sacred geometry. That particular graffito has been studied and is generally dated to the Ptolemaic or Roman era, most likely made by later visitors rather than the original builders, which would place it many centuries after Seti I, not before him. These theories persist because the building genuinely is strange-looking, and because a plain, heavy, waterlogged hall behind an ornately decorated temple does invite the imagination. But strangeness is not the same as evidence, and the specific claims made about impossibly ancient dates or impossibly advanced builders have not held up against the physical record pulled directly out of the ground. What is left, once you set the more sensational claims aside, is still a genuinely remarkable story, arguably more interesting than the mystery version, because it is true. A new kingdom pharaoh, ruling at the height of Egyptian imperial power, ordered his architects to design a building that would look and feel ancient, heavy, and primordial on purpose, in order to physically embody one of the oldest myths in his civilization's religion. He had the resources to haul 100-ton blocks of granite 250 miles down the Nile and set them with a level of precision that still impresses engineers today, and he chose to spend that extraordinary capability not on decoration or self-glorification, but on architectural silence. The Osireion was never meant to dazzle visitors the way the temple in front of it does. It was meant to feel like standing at the edge of the world before the world existed, dark, wet, heavy, and old, because that is exactly what its builders wanted a person walking into it to feel. There's also something worth sitting with in the fact that the first excavators, Neville and Murray, were not wrong to feel that pull toward an older date. They were reading the architecture honestly, without yet having the stratigraphic tools Frankfurt would later use to date it properly. Their instinct was a reasonable response to a building designed, quite deliberately, to feel like it came from an earlier age. In a strange way, the Osireion succeeded exactly as its builders intended. It fooled experienced professional excavators into feeling, in their bones, that they were standing in something ancient, even though they were standing in a very deliberate work of New Kingdom religious theater. So the next time you see a video or an article claiming the Osireion is proof of a lost civilization, or that it could not have been built by the ancient Egyptians, remember what the stone itself actually says once you dig down to its foundations. It says a king wanted to touch the beginning of time and build a room that would let him do it. That is not a mystery beyond human capability. It is a monument to exactly how far human capability, paired with a very old story about darkness turning into light, could go. If you want to understand where the real edge between mystery and evidence sits at other ancient sites, that is where this channel lives. So let me know in the comments which structure you want unpacked next, and I will meet you there.